Hello and welcome to the EUA webinar series toward Tirana 2024. We are today at webinar number 6, where we will be talking about the social dimension of higher education. Note to tech support, could we have the slides, please? Here we go. Very good. So as mentioned, this webinar is part of an ongoing series of EUA webinars on the Bologna process. And today we would like to talk about the social dimension, its context and its future. Before I start the webinar and introduce our speakers, just a couple of words on housekeeping. When you joined this webinar, you first came into a welcome page on our CUN platform. In this welcome page, you will actually be able to find both the recording of this webinar as well as the PowerPoint presentations of all speakers. You will also be able to find other webinars that were part of the series, as well as the presentations and materials offered there. And this also includes a little introductory webinar that has been produced about the Bologna process, as you can see here in the middle of my slide. On the right-hand side of your screen, there are several ways of interacting with us today, and I would very much encourage you to do so. First of all, you have the chat function, and here you can say hello to your fellow participants, tell us where you're from, which institution, what country. You can also comment on the discussion and share your own experiences should you wish to do so. The Q&A function, however, is for specific questions to the speakers of the webinar. So please, if you have a question directly to a specific speaker, please say or mention their name in your question as well. All participants can actually upvote specific questions that appear in the Q&A by clicking the like button so that they move up a little bit in the Q&A, and I as a moderator will be able to easier identify interesting questions that I can pose to our speakers. Oh, sorry, that was one too far. And indeed, our speakers are, I'm joined here today by Alexander Sushner, Agnes Charolta, and Ninoslav Schmidt on our panel. A bit of background. Alexander is the institutional coordinator for the EUFA Alliance at University of Rijeka in Croatia. His main areas of work at the moment include the European Degree Label Initiative, the development of the educational offer of EUFA, and the coordination of the University of Rijeka expert in the context of the Alliance. He has a very strong background in quality assurance, having conducted several internal quality evaluations at University of Rijeka, but also several reviews at national and international level. Now, despite his current job title, Alexander will actually provide us with an institutional perspective on the social dimension and present the approach of University Rijeka with regards to diversity and inclusion. We are also joined by Agnes from Eötvös Loránd University in Hungary. Agnes is an assistant professor at the Barsi Gustav Faculty of Special Needs Education in Budapest, Hungary. Since 2019, she also has been the leader of the Inclusiveness team in the CHARM EU University Alliance. And throughout her academic and professional career, Agnes has focused on universal design educational models, social inclusion, diversity, disability, and also human rights education. Now, Agnes will present a perspective from a European University Alliance with regards to enhancing the social dimension, enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of a European alliance. So in addition to those institutional perspectives, the panel is also joined by Nino Schmidt. And Nino is the founder of the Institute for Development of Education in Croatia, where he served as executive director since 1999. And in the last 2 rounds of the Bologna process, together with the European Student Union, Nino has also co-chaired the Bologna Follow-up Group, a working group on the social dimension. In the last round, that was joined by 27 countries and 5 consultative members, including EUA. And Nino will contrast the institutional perspectives delivered by Alexander and Agnes and discuss the European or the Bologna policy context on the social dimension, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I myself would like to set the scene, though, with a couple of words of our organizations, of EUA's activity on the topic of equity, diversity, and inclusion. I just put a couple of examples on the slide here. These are several of our reports that we have issued on the topic over the years. I can say in summary that really over the last, let's say, 10 or 5 years, we have seen a really rising interest at our universities with regards to the theme of EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this is reflected also in our work when we survey our member, when they join us in projects such as, for instance, on the slide here, the Invited project, such as our monitoring that we conduct in the trend surveys, or also in dedicated thematic projects. Here's an example from the field of learning and teaching and approaches to diversity and inclusion promotion in this very context. I put all the hyperlinks to our reports here on the slide, and as previously mentioned, these will of course be shared with you in the CVIN platform, which remains open for you. Now, as mentioned, indeed, equity, diversity, and inclusion are of high priority for our higher education institutions. I put here a little teaser, so to say, of a trends report that we are actually to publish within the next month or so, EUA Trends 2024, a survey of almost 500 higher education institutions in almost all of the countries of the European higher education area. We had a dedicated section on the social dimension in this survey, so I invite you to have a look into our full report when we publish it in the summer of this year. But just to give you a couple of examples to set a scene here, for almost all of the universities, or the vast majority, 90% here, equity, diversity, and inclusion is indeed an explicit value. Universities do see it as a major priority. The vast majority also then, of course, has strategies and policies addressing EDI in place at their institution, albeit this taking very different forms and shapes, as we will also hear from our speakers later on. There are at 83% of the universities dedicated actions in place throughout the institution, so not only at specific faculties, that foster the enhancement of EDI at the university. And from I think the biggest jump in support for this topic that we have seen in Trends 2024 in comparison to previous studies was with regards to considering EDI in recruitment of both staff, but also of students. So you can see here that around 2/3 of university consider equity in staff recruitment, and almost the same goes also for student recruitment. And this, of course, may be linked to government policies. Again, 2/3 say that their government places this as a high priority topic in the context of their higher education system. But this is really contrasted then by a lack of funding, so to say. As you can see here, in only 39% of the cases, government actually provides a dedicated funding support for equity, diversity, and inclusion actions at higher education institutions. I would also like to reflect a little bit more on the dimension of recruitment, as we have seen such a high rise in interest in this field over the last 5 years or so. I did here a little ranking of the dimensions that are considered in higher education institutions when it comes to students and staff with regards to their policies. And you can see here that overall, there are similar dimensions that are addressed in strategies and policy, both for students and for staff. Disability always coming up as one of the main priority areas to be considered by institutional strategies. But then it changes a little bit between the different target groups. So for students, for instance, you have a slightly higher focus on socioeconomic backgrounds, whereas, for instance, for staff, there's perhaps a higher interest or a higher priority set for caring responsibilities of the staff. Overall, it is quite striking that there are vast differences between higher education systems of how universities focus on different themes of different dimensions of EDI. Just to give you a concrete example, migration, refugee-like, and at-risk background, 57% of universities said that they consider this topic in their strategies or policies for their students, which is actually also quite a high number, I would say. But this differs very much between countries. So for instance, more than 80% of universities in Finland, Norway, and the UK, as well as all of the universities in Ireland, address this topic in their strategies for diversity, whereas on the other end, only a third or less consider this topic in Austria, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, and Sweden. So there are definitely vast differences in the themes that are addressed, and these themes indeed might be set by government policies or linked to government policies and priorities, which in turn, of course, are also perhaps supported or even framed by the Bologna process. And so I will try and give you a 1-minute roundup of the 20 years of history of diversity, equity, inclusion in the Bologna process. Of course, we have Nino as a speaker later on who can go into much more detail, but just to set the scene for you on this as well, on the policy perspective from the EHEA, the first time that the social dimension came up was with the Prague Communiqué signed by the ministers in 2001. There, they reaffirmed the need to take account of the social dimension explicitly in the Bologna process. And this was then later further developed into a definition that was part of the London Communiqué, where the ministers agreed that the composition of the student body entering, participating in, and completing higher education at all levels should correspond to the social profile of society at large in the EHEA countries. On my slide here, then, I make a huge jump from 2007 to 2020, of course, acknowledging that there has been quite a lot of activities and different ministerial communiques as well, trying to foster a culture of social dimension in the EHEA. 2020 is the current status quo. This will be, of course, replaced very soon at the end of this month with the Tirana communique. But just to let you know, in 2020, the ministers adopted the principles and guidelines to strengthen the social dimension of higher education, developed in the dedicated working group that Nino has co-chaired and will present on later on. And in the 2020 communique, the ministers also committed to implement the principles, to have policy dialogue with all relevant stakeholders, and then also to support higher education institutions in integrating those principles into their institutional missions and strategies. So, I would like to now hear from you before I hand over to the speaker about those missions and strategies. And we have a little poll here waiting. And in this poll, if you come from a higher education institutions, please let us know whether your institution actually has a strategy, a dedicated strategy, or perhaps an overarching one addressing diversity and inclusion. I will give you like half a minute or so. Please click. It's a single response. Okay. Yes. If we could also already show the results as they come in. Yes, thank you. I think we can close the poll if our support team could show the polling results to the participants as well. I think overall our participants are quite expert on this topic. 45% saying they have an overarching strategy at the university that also, amongst many other things, addresses diversity. 48%, it keeps changing, a dedicated one, so very good. And the remainder actually planning to have one in the very near future. So that sounds really good already. As a president, I hope that you can make use of this knowledge and experience that you have at your universities and feed it into good questions and comments in the chat and Q&A throughout the webinar. But now I would like to hand over to Alexander to hear about his university's strategic approaches on this topic.
Yes, thank you, and I will start sharing my screen in just a second. Okay, I hope that it works, right? So welcome everyone. Thank you for the nice introduction. This part of the webinar is intended to just very briefly provide you with, let's say, a sneak peek into the policies and practices on social dimension of the University of Rijeka. So we are a mid-sized university in Croatia with around 17,000 students and a member of the EUA European University Alliance. Now, I start this with just a brief outline of the national policy framework because that is our starting point, and indeed it should be our starting point. So this is a brief history, of course, not of all work on social dimension that has been done in Croatia, but let's say of a more explicit and intense work on social dimension on the Croatian national level. So in 2015, the ministry established the National Working Group for Enhancement on Social Dimension of Higher Education. And the main task of this National Working Group was to produce the first national plan for enhancement of social dimension that you can see on the slide was actually adopted in 2019. But before that was done, a background document was prepared. The document called Underrepresented and Vulnerable Groups in Croatian Higher Education. It was published in 2016, and it is basically an analytical document, a synthesis of different research and other sources of insight into the vulnerability factors of the student body in Croatia. When the document was finalized, it included 18 underrepresented and or vulnerable groups that were detected here. I will not list all of them here, but I will just briefly maybe mention that the list includes what I guess we can call the usual suspects and what you would encounter in probably each country: students of low socioeconomic status, the students who are first generation higher education students in their family, gender differences per scientific discipline, etc. But it also includes some vulnerable groups which are specific for Croatia, or at least are maybe not present throughout Europe, such as the Roma ethnic minority, such as children of war veterans, etc. So this was the basis. As I mentioned, the first national plan was produced in 2019, and then an updated version, a second national plan, was adopted in 2023. It will last until 2025. It has 10 sections. Again, I will not list it, but I thought that it is interesting to mention that these sections, or basically groups of activities, were based on the European principles and guidelines to strengthen the social dimension of higher education. So the document, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but if not, you can see it also at this link. Moving on to University of Rijeka policies. Of course, I start here with the strategy, our ongoing strategy 21 to 25. So here we have quantitative and qualitative indicators in the strategy, and among the qualitative indicators, we have one which is specifically dedicated to social dimension of higher education. Inclusivity, equity, diversity is also present in the I would say contextualization of our university strategic goals and explaining their purpose in the context of the mission and vision. And finally, something that I actually think is especially important is that the strategic plan includes priorities for implementation. And here, social dimension is present actually in 3 elements, as the ones that you can see listed on this slide. Now, in addition to the strategy as, of course, an institutional document, I have to say that a really strong push at our institution, a strong push for implementation of the EDI initiatives comes from our current management. And here are just some brief outlines from our rector's program. So this was part of her nomination for her current mandate, which actually also overlaps with the strategic the period of the ongoing strategy. And you can see here in writing this commitment, which I have to say is really felt in person every day, basically, at our university. So for our management, this is really not just a certain trend that is to be respected, something to pay lip service to, but really in our daily work, we can feel that for our management, it's actually very important that we live these values. I will just direct your attention to the third element, where in the director's program, a specific unit is emphasized, and that is the University Counseling Center, because I will present that on the next slide. And the importance there is given actually to the professional staff, to the experts who can deliver these services. I move now to the practices, to what we are actually doing, and it was very difficult to sum it all up in one short presentation. But as I said, this will hopefully serve as a sneak peek, and if you're interested, we can always follow up on that. I start with what can be called the structural dimension, maybe even the infrastructural, and that is, as I said, the professional staff, the experts. Now, the hub of expertise for social dimension, for broadening accessibility of higher education for us, is the University Counseling Center. Now, you might have questions why this is the case, why the name, what the reason is basically historical, as I will talk a bit more about on the next slide. When we first started with implementing these student support services, we started from the counseling in the narrow sense and with support for students with disabilities. This was all housed under this one center, but over time the name remained, but the scope of activities was significantly broadened. And what you can see here in Croatian is just the welcome page of the University Counseling Center, saying that seeking help is not a sign of weakness, but of maturity, part of the ever-going and very rapid shift in mindset that we can observe among our students, by the way, that the students are becoming more and more open about different types of issues that they encounter. Now, just a few more words about the counseling center. So there are three streams of activities: the psychological counseling, and here, as I mentioned, it moved from the, let's say, narrow sense to a broad sense, because really this unit is there to support students, or at least to serve as the initial contact point, as the first stop in any type of difficulty that they might encounter, whether it relates to the learning process, whether it relates to their life in general. So in a time, and I will talk about this also when we come to the challenges, in a time when it's almost difficult to even know in advance what will be all the issues what will be all the barriers that the students face. This is kind of the entry point which serves to kind of capture the broader spectrum of students. Career and academic guidance, I won't go much into details about this. I think this is quite self-evident, but the part which is most relevant for today's topic is the Student Support Office. And this is the office that actually started, as I mentioned, as an office for support for students with disabilities, because this was the first vulnerable group chronologically that we started working with, decades ago. And then over time, the scope broadened. Now it is effectively an equity, diversity, and inclusivity office, which really deals with many different let's say, dimensions of providing equal opportunities for students, and also does a lot of work which is proactive, not only reactive, of course. Now, in addition to, when I try to select just three things that I will emphasize here on a practical level, in addition to this infrastructural level, the second thing that comes to mind necessarily is these attempts at transversal integration. Successful attempts, I would hope so. So the way that our management sees our social dimension policies and practices is that they need to be integrated in all of our activities. So what you will see here are just some examples of that. I start with the basics. University of Rijeka study regulations, and absolutely most important regulatory document that we have, because this is really almost the constitution of how our education is delivered. And this document outlines specific targets of students for specific adaptations of study regulations. So study regulations have certain level of flexibility for the students that are in need of this. On the other hand, and this is very important, it also puts the obligation on the university level, faculty level, and departmental level to provide certain additional support. Now, in general, we do not have for University of Rijeka specific a list of specific underrepresented and vulnerable groups for us. We, in general, we use the list that was produced on the national level with very small modifications. The additional work that we do is that we just try to contextualize that, and we try to see in which types of circumstances or environments specific groups of students are maybe experiencing this vulnerability more. Integration with our quality assurance system, something that's very close to me personally. As you have heard in the beginning, my primary expertise is in quality assurance, and this is something I worked on. So integration of social dimension elements, dimensions, indicators in our QA system. I mentioned here two things. Something that's for us a gold standard in evaluating ourselves is our study program evaluation upon graduation, and we have added socio-demographic characteristics to this evaluation, which enables us to compare how different groups of students perceive their education. Also, we have our internal quality assurance standards, because we also do internal auditing at the University of Rijeka. And these standards are, of course, based on the European standards and guidelines. But we have expanded them with social dimension elements, which I think is interesting in the current time when there are some discussions about the ESG revision. Should maybe social dimension feature more prominently in the European standards and guidelines for quality assurance? So we have already done that in Rijeka. And finally, I couldn't talk about this transversal integration without kind of trying to capture all the breadth of activities that happen in a more bottom-up way, and yet they always include references to social dimension. From different actions and activities that and the projects that we have on sustainable development goals, to work with student associations, with our University of Rijeka Student Union, where, for example, recently a really interesting project on menstrual poverty was done, which was then taken up on the national level. We were very proud of that. And our Gender Equality Council's activities in accordance with the plan, where I can say that we are quite proud that University of Rijeka has been a front runner in this topic at the national level, but I would also say the regional level, and we are very proud to be able to share these experiences with many universities in our surroundings. And finally, the last slide, I was also asked to reflect here on a few challenges. You will see 3 of them here. All 3 of them are interlinked. The first one is a very nice example of how a challenge doesn't have to be something negative. It can be actually exactly what you want, but it still poses certain challenges for your work. This, what we can call diversification of student body, and not only in what we can call their objective characteristics, but also, and maybe even primarily, in the way that the students perceive themselves and how they react to certain difficulties and barriers, and how they are more honest and open about it, poses increasing challenges in capturing everything. Here, we have heard that Agnes will refer to principles of universal design, and that is something we try to live by, but it is not easy. It is not easy when you have such different groups with such different issues. How do you tackle that? When there's a smaller number of such vulnerable groups, it's of course much easier to handle it. But the mentality shift that is happening here is also to stop thinking about them in terms of groups, in terms of categories, and more perhaps in terms of specific vulnerability factors, which can then interact with each other and produce a very complex intersectionality network, and that you have to handle with if you want to be truly fair to all of these students and their individual circumstances. Now, this is connected with the push to kind of work with such students to develop appropriate measures. That's a very basic principle that I think we all adhere to. But it is increasingly difficult because you're not sure always with whom to talk to and at which level of, let's say, refinement, which level of granularity do you need to go to really design specific targeted measures. And finally, the outreach. Now, the image here that you can see is basically just a joke about sampling bias, but I think there's a more fundamental issue there. We want to talk with the students who face barriers in accessing and successfully completing higher education. But if we only talk to those who are already at the university, there's a very obvious problem here. On the other hand, for a university, it is very difficult to do effective outreach and to really reach those who are not yet in our system, to really see what we can do for them. So these would be 3 challenges to outline here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alexander, for this very interesting overview of the approach of University of Rijeka. I see that just in the very last moment, there's a question come in. It comes from Niels Tensi. I would like to pose it to you. If I understand correctly, the counseling center at University of Rijeka is a central unit. How do you interact with individual faculties, departments, and so on? And how do you make sure that you're visible also amongst the student body and staff body at your university? A very good question. Thank you, Niels.
Yeah, and it's even better question if you would know how decentralized we are. We are extremely decentralized. So faculties in Croatia are even their own legal entities. So that is actually a very spot on question. However, the University Counseling Center is, if I would have to, choose one central service at the university that is best recognized, it would actually be that one. Among the students, among the staff, among the faculty management, everyone knows about the counseling services, counseling center and the services that they provide. Specifically, one of these 3 units dedicated to student support, so the one that's most relevant for our today's topic, works a lot with the staff in providing expertise in, for example, adapting the learning and teaching process to specific circumstances of students. So they're often the first contact for individual teachers and the management when they need to do certain modifications. I would, and among the students, really, we cannot complain about the level of recognition because the students are being more and more open, and really, I think everyone knows about these services.
Very good. Thank you so much. And for time reasons, I will not pick another question, but hand over to Agnes now, who will present a perspective from a European University Alliance. Agnes, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I hope that the slides are on. Yes, I can see. I hope also the participants can see. My name is Agnes Sarolta Fazekas-Vinkovics. I am coming from Budapest, Hungary, from the Eötvös Loránd University. And today I'm connecting the inclusion and diversity aspects of the Charm EU Alliance. Next slide, please. Or I can do that. Yes, exactly. Perfect. Then I can do that. Okay. And I also take the timer as well for access needs. It's also to respecting access needs for the time. So the time is on. So what is the diversity and inclusion mainstreaming in Charm EU? Mainstreaming is a key word. I will explain in a minute. And Charm EU stands for Challenge-Driven, Accessible, Research-Based Mobile European University. And how is diversity and inclusion is mainstream is that the very first moment then when we successfully were approved by the European Commission, one of the key aspects of the Alliance was to set up key values and principles and mission and vision as the Charm EU started to bloom and grow. And inclusion was one of the key aspects. And we also created a text together with many colleagues, also individuals with lived experiences, to really reflect on the needs and on the diversity of societies. And I shared with you the text, so you can also read it, but I would like to highlight key words: open, welcoming, mutual respect, and all kinds of backgrounds. And we are also approached this diversity and inclusion with a holistic, intersectional, and human rights-based approach. What does intersectional means in that sense is that Henriette might also ask me that, okay, what are the target groups that we are considering? I will share with you in a minute, but I want to highlight here, as I also highlight at my conferences or presentations, that we should see individuals in their full diversity and in their multiple identities, barriers, privileges, and also difficulties that they face in societies, also difficulties that society puts as a barrier. So these are the key approach, and of course we follow relevant legislation. And I also share, yes, let's share the next slide. So inclusiveness, what is mainstream? This is what I was mentioning. Mainstream means that knocking on every door and bringing this agenda to all kinds of fields. This is the transversal approach. In the past, we were a work package, but already in 2020, we moved into this opening doors policy, meaning that we knocked on the door of the governance group, of the communication team, of the Charmy Alliance, etc. And since 2023, we are under the governance work package, and I will explain why. And then we also started to work from 2021 that it's not only a service approach, but rather a strategic approach, because we would like to be a role model for social inclusion in terms of diverse and complex societies. And as Alexander also mentioned, my field of research is also universal design of learning, but I also wanted to ensure that step by step we approach this thing. And of course, many colleagues, many universities and many colleagues for this model is still new, because higher education historically has been approached by that new groups have been entered in the last 30-40 years. If we look at the historical background of higher education, if you look at 1960s or after the Second World War, so it's quite new to have these groups. So, but the new approach, the innovative new approach is that if we start something new, we should consider the greatest extent of users and design the space as inclusive as possible from the beginning, from the zero moment, as I say, and rather managing these as a retrospective approach. Of course, historically, our institutions are not built like this, but this is what we need, and definitely time and resources are key for that approach. And I'm also happy to share relevant research and also relevant documentation that we produced in the Charmy Alliance, and you can access under the toolkit section of the website. Next slide. I go to the next slide. Yes. Let me see. Just one. Come back. Yes. So Henrietta asked me, okay, Agnes, please share what are the strategies. Of course, I was delighted to share and highlighted that we mapped out grounds on equality among our partner institutions, mapped out national strategies, governmental and national legislations across the universities. And this is how we could identify the target groups. Of course, not only on the national level, but also on an institutional level. We checked what are the rules and regulations of universities that are in compliance with European, national, European, even global documents. And just as a reference point to Alexander, disability was mentioned. Of course, the United Nations have a Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and very uniquely, the European Union as an entity signed and ratified the UN Convention in 11. Yes. And here you can also see our research and the key findings. Next slide, I go. Yes, sorry, it's too fast. Next slide. What are the key active elements of implementation? First, I mentioned to you that already in 2020, when we had in February 2020 the first inclusion team meeting just before the pandemic hit, we decided that besides that it's extra workload, we want to open doors and co-creating with other work packages and organizational units. It was a commitment by our team and a commitment of other teams of this co-creation. So it's not just a it's not just a separate group that does inclusion. In terms of the master program, we have a global master program in CHARM, and we introduced at the accreditation policies, accreditation procedure, inclusion measures at the admission process, also the financial aid grants for the admission process. And since the editions of the masters, these are still running, and actually we are just completed this round of admissions this year as well. Next slide, I hope it goes. Yes. We also mentioned, or Alexander also mentioned, the variety of needs of individuals. We also carrying out a needs assessment, which is also in compliance with the students' needs, but also considering different life situation, even if they are not regulated yet, but we try to be as holistic and intersectional. We also support staff and students in terms of professional development sessions and tools and tips. And also we join to the SDGs and human rights issues in terms of global awareness raising. Next slide. These are coming back for a moment in the Q&A. And last but not least, I'm super delighted on behalf of the whole CHARM EU community and partner universities, and also highlighting the wonderful work of my team members and all the colleagues who have contributed. We have been applied in 2023 for the Zero Project Award. It's an open call for nomination of inclusive practices all around the world, and this prestigious call or prestigious award was going through on 3 rounds of selection rounds, and from the beginning 543 applications from all around globally, not only from Europe but all around globally, have been reached, and the prestigious jury selected, experts selected the 77 best practices, and I'm delighted that we were one of them, and we are very proud. And I also mentioned to my colleagues that it's a moment for celebration, but it's a commitment for the future. And basically that's it, and thank you so much. And I still have 42 seconds to go, and I give back the floor to Henrietta. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Agnes, for this excellent overview of the approach within the CHARM EU Alliance. Very interesting, and thanks for highlighting especially how you mapped out the different approaches at the universities that are part of your alliance and try to bring them on par. Maybe this is actually a topic that we can come back to in the discussion. I see always at the very last minute there's questions come in. Let me have a look. Yes, I have a question from David Crozier. David is from Eurydice, as you may know, in charge of the Bologna implementation report, amongst other things. And he asked, has there been any change in the demography of students in the CHARM EU universities? Do you have data on how the target groups have changed since the adoption of your universal design or inclusion policies overall? Thank you, David.
Thank you so much for these questions. Yes, we have. So we have, when we introduced all these measures into the accreditation process, all the documents, we are measuring qualitative and quantitative data. The most easiest one is to measure the student cohort, and of course we consider also students and staff, but we check that how many students have tick the inclusion box at the admission process. So we have the number there. We also have the number that how many students have been successfully admitted to the program. We oversee the whole CharmEU master program duration in terms of access needs and everything that is during the studies. And we also check out dropouts and diploma, completing of the diploma. So we have the measures, we have the numbers. I don't have here in my notes here with me, but we have the data. And just an addition, we also created this 2023 when we went to the second round of the CharmEU, that we are now working on a very detailed indicator system, which helps to map and organize that how efficiently we are working on inclusion, not just the master program, but the whole organizational culture. So for all the work packages and organizational units, we have qualitative and quantitative data. And if I may say, we will go into the, just one thing, that we will go into the mapping part this autumn. So this is a good work, a good thing to do. Yes,
absolutely. No, and thanks for mentioning that. And I think the indicator system that you mentioned is indeed also a good lead over to Nino's presentation that will follow, because indicators were indeed one of the biggest parts of our work in the Bologna process on social dimension in the last round. As a small lead over to also engage our participants again, we'll just have a very quick small poll before I give the floor to Nino. You may recall from my presentation that not all of the institutions that participated in our trend survey actually had also explicit government policy support. To our tech support, could we please open poll number 2? And so I would like to ask the participants of the webinar whether in your country there are national policies or strategies in place to support the institution's work in this field. Here you can select as many options as you wish. And I'll give you a few seconds to do so. Okay, slowly coming in. Yes. I see a very mixed result. Actually, if we could also display the results to the participants as they come in. I think from what I see here, for, well, a quarter of our participants or so, there are dedicated policies for students, a fifth, so a little bit less for staff. And only in 16%, these are also set with different targets and indicators. And national funding only at 13% of our participating or our participants' institutions, or in the national context of our participants. So this is very interesting, and I hope it sets the scene a little bit to what Nino will now present to us with regards to the policy context, of course, with largely the focus on the EHEA level. Thanks, Nino. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Henriette. So I'm really very glad, Henriette, that I have the possibility to speak on the work of the Bologna Follow-up Group, more particularly on the work of the working group on social dimension. And as you mentioned, I had a pleasure to co-chair the working group on social dimension within the Bologna since 2018, and on behalf of Croatia, and I work as director at the Institute for the Development of Education in Croatia. Since I would say 2018, European higher education area has significantly progressed in advancing the social dimension, and it is demonstrated through, I would say, 4 important achievements. The first one is that we have the new definition of the social dimension, and we created it in 2020. And it says that this is a process aimed at creating an inclusive environment in higher education in which the composition of the student body at all levels corresponds to the heterogeneous social profile of society at large. And this definition encompasses also the desired inclusive environment in higher education that fosters, as you can see, equity, diversity, and is responsive to the needs of local communities. So the term social dimension within the Bologna process encompasses 4 distinct but still interconnected concepts of diversity, equality of opportunities, equity, and inclusion. The fourth fact is that the Ministers of Education of Bologna process adopted in 2020 principles and guidelines. Social dimension, we have 10 principles, and principles cover different areas, but they are understood as high-level statements that serve as a basis for the conceptualization of different policies for social dimension. And each principle has guidelines, which are the recommendations intended to advise policymakers on how the principles should be implemented in practice. The third important achievement that we achieved this year is that we succeeded to create indicators and descriptors, and we expect that the ministers of the Bologna process will adopt it now at the end of this month in Tirana, this document. Indicators we define as tools for measuring progress in implementing the principles of the social dimension, and each indicator has its descriptor, which outlines characteristics of the indicators in more detail, providing a better understanding of the indicators and how they can be implemented. This document is not prescriptive, so we adopted the toolbox approach, which enables EHEA countries to implement them in a way that suits their national higher education systems. Indicators and descriptors are important because they enable the creation of a European level and also national level systems of monitoring the progress in the implementation of the principles. And the fourth achievement connected with the previous 3 is that we this year finished what we call EHEA policy framework for the social dimension, which consists of the 10 principles and guidelines, indicators and descriptors, and a European and national level system of monitoring of the implementation of the principles. So I can say that the framework represents a coherent system that enables public authorities to incorporate social dimension principles in different strategies and policies. I'm very glad that we, with the help of the Eurydice, also now have facts, and we can see how the countries are progressing in the implementation of the principles. And here you can see the results of the forthcoming report, Bologna Implementation Report 2024, that will be published by Eurydice by the end of this month, just before the Tirana conference. And this principle is on inclusive institutional cultures. And for that purpose, there are 4 indicators that show basically how the governments are helping higher education institutions in organizing a training for higher education staff and for both academic and administrative staff, or if they have created kind of a monitoring body that can monitor the implementation of the principles. So out of these 4 indicators, we can see the composite scorecard indicator that shows to which extent the countries are implementing this principle on inclusive institutional culture. And we see that half of the countries in Europe in green progressing very well, but we do have also almost half of them also maybe that are not progressing so well, particularly those in red color. It is also possible that we provide an overview of how the countries are progressing related to a single indicator. So here you can see the results related on how the countries are supporting higher education institutions for staff training on social dimension. And we see that some countries, like for instance Ireland, they have created a national access plan, which is basically a strategic approach to social dimension, but they have also supplemented it by targeted funding opportunities that promote teaching and learning enhancement, especially in universal design. And in Flemish community in Belgium, they provide a support to a public organization called CIHO to develop and organize training on student mental health issues. So again, when we compare the countries in Europe, we see that half of the countries are basically providing really support to their higher education institutions to improve their training on social dimension, but half of them, they just don't. Maybe another example related to the principle which says that public authorities should engage in a policy dialogue with higher education institutions and other relevant stakeholders about how the above principles and guidelines can be translated and implemented both at national and institutional level. We see that almost 19 countries basically have not started a policy dialogue with their higher education institutions on how to implement principles on social dimension within their national context. But then we see that almost also half of them in green that they do have some activities in this regard. And at the end, maybe it's important to share also some good practices because, for instance, in Austria, they organize annual networking conferences that bring together a wide array of stakeholders from the higher education sector. They discuss interim evaluations of the Austrian national strategy on the social dimension, ensuring continuous stakeholder engagement and feedback. So we see that there is certainly a space for improvement in Europe in improving social dimension policies. And I'll just conclude with one more fact, also with the findings of the 2020 report of the Eurydice, which also shows how the countries are implementing the principles and guidelines all across Europe. And as you can see, the result indicates that European systems have implemented nearly 42% of the policies required to meet the commitments related to the principles of the social dimension. So I would say that it shows that the countries are engaged, but certainly there is a space for improvement in the future. And for that reason, I think it is important that the countries also follow the work of the Bologna Follow-up Working Group on Social Dimension. And on the EHEA info website, they can check how we are progressing, and all of the documents that I mentioned are there. Henriette?
Thanks so much, Nino, for this interesting overview and also for sharing with us a bit more about the context as well as data on progress and the room that there is for improvement. As ever too often, unfortunately, we're almost running out of time. I hope that my speakers do not mind if I keep them for 5 minutes longer so we can pick up one or two discussion questions as well. And I hope the participants are okay with that as well. Now, Nino finished off on the progress progress, but also room for improvement. So let's talk about potential improvement. Alexander, you already mentioned concrete challenges. Perhaps I would like to start with Agnes and also reflect on challenges from her perspective in enhancing inclusion in the context of her institution or the alliance. And then maybe as a group, we can talk about suggested recommendations of how to overcome these challenges. So Agnes, I'll start with you, please.
Thank you so much. And this was the slide that we went through. So I highlighted key challenges and also three challenges and three solutions. One of the elements is definitely resources, limited resources that was also mentioned by the colleagues as well. And this is number one. So again, the solution is that strategically it should be considered how we should invest in inclusion and diversity and how this value is important for institutions in compliance with global trends in higher education. The second challenge is the retrospective approach of inclusive design. This is where I highlighted at my presentation that historically it's understandable, but once we create something new, when we create a new study program, a new master, we should design from the space as inclusive as possible. And this is the solution that we have in mind, in our hearts and minds. And number three is the discussion that I'm also hearing on a global level as well, and also on a European level, is that inclusion and diversity is a service or a strategy. And historically, again, it's more a service, but in Charm EU, we are moving towards a systematically and profoundly implemented or established strategic approach for this. And I think that also the global challenges are also suggesting that we should consider these. So these are my three challenges and three solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And perhaps I now give the floor to Alexander. Similar challenges, similar solutions at your university or perhaps in the alliance that you are part of?
The institutional level and the alliance level challenges are significantly different, I would say. I mean, they overlap, but on an alliance level, we have this very interesting interplay of different national contexts, which means also different cultural and socio-political contexts and different cultures, I would say, or mentalities in how to approach these issues. And by the way, this doesn't have to be negative. Good things can come out of this interplay, but it's definitely been something to tackle. On an institutional level, but again, I think that this is a general point. I think that And yeah, again, it's a general point, but I think it's very relevant for this issue. It's so important to create organic buy-in, organic commitment, also from those who are maybe not initially predisposed to have this buy-in. So what I'm trying to say is, and I have noticed this not, again, only in the policies of social dimension, but in many things that we do in higher education. People who are here in the room are committed. We typically work on developing those policies, the toolboxes, mechanisms, etc. When it's time to kind of disseminate them and integrate them in the everyday lives of our institutions, I think we need to pay much more attention to the question of why are we doing this, and not only on how and what. Yeah. We tend sometimes, I have a feeling, to forget that, because for us it's so obvious, it's automatic, we don't even think about it. So we go straight to how, like, oh, let me show you this amazing tool, this amazing process that we have developed. But we need to be mindful of always starting with the why, and to really try to bring these topics to people who are not currently that much into them. That's for me the biggest challenge that I can see.
Very good point. Thank you very much, Alexander. Now, talking to only those that are in the system you mentioned, or having very different cultures and approaches between institutions. Leading over to Nino, we've seen very much different approaches also in the data that you have presented across the EHEA. Would you say that there are common challenges on, really creating a culture across the European higher education area in making the social dimension a reality?
We at the BFUG working group of social dimension believe that securing the implementation of the new EHEA framework of the social dimension in member states until the end of this decade is crucial. And I think for that purpose, three things are important. First, I would say to exchange good practices among EHEA member states, because it will help them understanding how the implementation of the framework addresses the various social and economic challenges facing the higher education sector. Second, the successful implementation of the framework will depend on effectively integrating the social dimension of higher education with other policy areas in higher education, like learning and teaching, research, outreach, governance, quality assurance, funding. And the third element that is certainly very important is to secure regular monitoring of the implementation of all 10 principles, both at the European and national level. And for that purpose, we propose to the BFUG to continue the work of the working group in the next 3 years, or if that is maybe not convenient, then to think about establishing a peer thematic peer group on social dimension, because then it can speed up the whole process also at the European level. Thank you, Henriette.
Thanks, Nino. Thanks for this overview also on the future of the Bologna process. I hope that this peer learning will, of course, involve higher education institutions as well as policymakers. I think in the way that Alexander has presented it, the way that it has been done in Croatia was a very interesting approach. And so I hope that in the future we will also see this in other countries. I'm afraid we're running out of time. And so if you allow me, unless you would like to make a final statement or comment, then I would close this webinar just with my own final slide that I would like to ask our tech support to display. Of course, I have to inform you about our next activities, which are further down. Hang on just a sec. The Bologna webinar series is not finished yet. And we have 2 more webinars coming up. And it's, loading very slowly. Here we go. You will see us talking about indicators in more detail. We've seen a preview today in a way from the data that Nino has shown, but on 11th June, we will talk with Eurydice and ESU about what the indicators say about the state of the Bologna process. And then also after the Tirana Ministerial Conference, EUA will host a discussion between leaders of higher education institutions to discuss the actual content of the Tirana Communiqué that the ministers will adopt at the end of this month. So with us, I would like to close today's webinar. Thank you so much for your participation to the speakers and for your attention to our participants, and I wish you a pleasant afternoon.